I thought the worst day of my life was when the doctors told me my 7-year-old daughter Emma would never walk again. I was wrong. The worst day was watching my brother Cedrick deliberately push her wheelchair down a flight of stairs during our family reunion in Phoenix, then listening to my parents Cairos and Mariel laugh it off as just another accident. Emma's screams still echo in my mind, the sickening sound of metal hitting concrete steps, the way Cedrick smirked and shrugged when she landed in a crumpled heap at the bottom. But what shattered me wasn't the physical assault on my vulnerable daughter. It was my parents rushing to comfort him, telling me to stop being so dramatic and that these things happen. They thought their decades of gaslighting had broken me completely. They were wrong. Because Emma's physical therapist, Andrea, saw the bruises that didn't match an accident, made one phone call, and triggered an investigation that would expose 20 years of systematic abuse and destroy their perfect family facade forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Ivy Terrelin, and I used to believe that love could overcome anything. That belief cost me 3 years of my daughter's safety and nearly destroyed both our lives. Emma had been in a wheelchair since she was 4, the result of a spinal cord injury from a car accident that took my husband's life and changed everything about ours. For 3 years, I'd been rebuilding our world around her needs, learning about accessibility, physical therapy schedules, and the peculiar strength that comes from watching your 7-year-old navigate challenges most adults couldn't handle. We lived in a modest ranch house in Tucson that I'd spent months modifying. Ramps where there used to be steps, wider doorways, a bathroom designed around Emma's wheelchair, grab bars painted bright yellow because she said they looked like sunshine. Every modification represented hope, adaptation, the promise that life could still be beautiful even when it looked nothing like what we'd planned. The physical therapy center became our second home. 3 times a week, Emma worked with Andrea, a therapist who had this gift for making the hardest exercises feel like games. Andrea never talked down to Emma, never acted like her wheelchair made her fragile or less capable. She pushed Emma to be stronger while respecting her limits, and Emma adored her for it. "Miss Andrea says I'm getting stronger," Emma would announce after each session, wheeling herself to the car with the fierce independence of someone who'd learned early that the world wouldn't always accommodate her needs. Those therapy sessions weren't just about physical strength. They were about Emma reclaiming her sense of self, building confidence that had been shattered along with her spine. Andrea understood that healing wasn't just about muscles and movement. It was about believing you deserved space in the world. My family had always been complicated, but after the accident, their dysfunction became more pronounced. My parents, Cairos and Mariel, lived in Phoenix about 2 hours away, in the same sprawling suburban house where my brother Cedrick still resided at 34. Cedrick had never held a job for more than 6 months, had never moved out, had never taken responsibility for anything more challenging than deciding what to watch on their massive television. Before Emma's accident, I'd made excuses for Cedrick's behavior. He was finding himself, or going through a rough patch, or any of the other gentle euphemisms families use when they can't admit someone they love is fundamentally broken. But after Emma's injury, when she needed patience and gentleness, Cedrick's casual cruelty became impossible to ignore. He made jokes about her wheelchair, called her Wheels instead of using her name, and had this habit of moving too quickly around her, forcing her to navigate around him like an obstacle. When I asked him to be more careful, my parents would immediately jump to his defense. "He doesn't mean anything by it," Marielle would say. "Cedrick just has a different sense of humor." "You're being too sensitive," Cairos would add. "Emma needs to learn that the world won't tiptoe around her." But Emma didn't need the world to tiptoe around her. She needed her family to show basic consideration and respect. She needed her uncle to see her as a person, not a punchline. The family reunion had been Mariel's idea. A weekend in Phoenix to bring everyone together and celebrate family. I'd hesitated, knowing how Cedrick behaved around Emma, but my parents had been insistent. It's important for Emma to be around family, Mariel had argued. She can't live in a bubble forever. I'd spent weeks preparing Emma for the visit, practicing responses to Cedrick's likely comments, reminding her that she didn't have to laugh at jokes that made her uncomfortable. We'd packed her favorite books, her art supplies, and the adaptive tools that made traveling easier. The night before we left for Phoenix, Emma had rolled her wheelchair into my bedroom while I was packing. "Mom," she'd said in that serious voice she used when something was really bothering her, "what if Uncle Cedrick is mean again?" I'd knelt down to her eye level, taking her small hands in mine. "Then we come home early," I'd promised. "Your safety and happiness are more important than any family gathering." She'd nodded, but I could see the worry in her dark eyes. Emma had developed an uncanny ability to read social situations since the accident, perhaps because she'd learned that her physical vulnerability required emotional vigilance. The drive to Phoenix that Friday morning felt like heading into a storm I could see coming but couldn't avoid. Emma chattered nervously about her physical therapy progress, about the new painting technique Andrea had shown her, about anything except what we both knew was waiting for us. When we arrived at my parents' house, the familiar weight of their expectations settled over me like a heavy coat. The house looked exactly the same: immaculate lawn, pristine exterior, the kind of suburban perfection that demanded everyone inside play their assigned roles, regardless of how well those roles actually fit. Mariel greeted us at the door with the kind of enthusiastic hug that felt performative, holding on just a beat too long while she studied Emma's face for signs of improvement that would never come. "Oh, sweetheart," she said to Emma, "you look so much stronger. Are you still doing all that therapy?" Emma nodded politely, but I could see her withdrawing slightly, the way she did when people talked about her condition like it was a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent part of her life. Cairos appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his smile warm but distant. He'd never quite known how to interact with Emma since the accident, as if her wheelchair had created a language barrier he couldn't overcome. "There's my favorite granddaughter," he said, which had been his standard greeting since she was born, even though she was his only granddaughter. Emma smiled genuinely at him. Despite his awkwardness, Cairos had never been cruel, just uncomfortable, and Emma seemed to understand the difference. That first evening passed peacefully enough. Emma played quietly in the living room while the adults caught up over dinner. She'd brought a puzzle that could be assembled at wheelchair height, and I watched her work methodically through the pieces, her concentration absolute. But I should have known the calm wouldn't last. I should have recognized the signs, the way Cedrick kept glancing at Emma with that calculating look he got when he was planning some demonstration of his own cleverness. I should have trusted my instincts and driven home that very first night. Instead, I let myself believe that maybe this time would be different. Maybe Cedrick had matured. Maybe my parents had spoken to him about appropriate behavior. Maybe Emma's obvious vulnerability would inspire some protective instinct in him. I was catastrophically wrong. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear, the kind of Arizona day where the sun makes everything look like it's been painted in watercolors. Emma woke up early, excited despite her nervousness, wheeling herself to the kitchen where Mariel was making pancakes and humming off-key. "Good morning, sunshine," Mariel said, but there was something forced about her cheerfulness, a brittleness that made me immediately alert. Cedrick emerged from his room around 10, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his hair standing at odd angles, moving with that particular sluggishness that suggested he'd been drinking late into the night. This wasn't unusual, unfortunately. What was different was the way his eyes immediately sought out Emma, as if he'd been planning something during the hours he should have been sleeping. "Morning, Wheels," he said, and Emma's shoulders tensed. Her name is Emma, I said quietly, not wanting to start the day with conflict, but unable to let it pass. Cedrick shrugged with exaggerated innocence. Just being friendly. The morning proceeded with the kind of careful navigation I'd become expert at, steering conversations away from topics that might trigger Cedrick's need to perform his cruelty, keeping Emma close enough to protect, but not so close that it looked like I was hovering. After lunch, Mariel suggested we all go out to the back patio to enjoy the weather. The house had a beautiful outdoor space, complete with a fire pit, comfortable seating, and a view of the desert mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The patio was accessible through sliding glass doors from the living room, but it required going down 3 concrete steps to reach the main seating area. I'd helped Emma navigate these steps dozens of times during previous visits, carefully, guiding her wheelchair down the slope that Cairos had installed years ago specifically for her. Emma had become quite skilled at managing the transition, but it still required concentration and careful maneuvering. She approached it the way she approached most physical challenges now, with determination and methodical precision. I was walking beside her wheelchair, my hand resting lightly on the back of her seat, not controlling but ready to assist if needed. Emma had been insistent about maintaining as much independence as possible, and I'd learned to find the balance between safety and autonomy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when Cedrick struck. I still don't know if it was planned or if the opportunity simply presented itself and his impulses took over. What I know is that one moment Emma was carefully positioning her wheelchair at the top of the slope, and the next moment Cedrick had pushed past me with deliberate force and shoved her wheelchair forward. Not a gentle push, not an accidental bump. A hard, 2-handed shove that sent Emma's wheelchair careening down the steps at a speed that made control impossible. Time seemed to fracture. I heard my own voice screaming Emma's name, but the sound felt disconnected from my body, like it was coming from somewhere else entirely. Emma's wheelchair hit the first step with a metallic crash that seemed to echo off every surface, then the second step, and then it was airborne. Emma's scream cut through everything else, pure terror and pain, and disbelief all compressed into a sound I'll never stop hearing. Her small body was thrown forward, her seatbelt the only thing preventing her from being flung completely from the chair. And when the wheelchair finally came to rest at the bottom of the steps, she was crumpled over the side, crying in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. I ran down those steps faster than I'd ever moved in my life, reaching Emma just as she was trying to pull herself upright. Her face was scraped and bleeding, her left arm was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn, and there was already swelling around her right eye where it had connected with the wheelchair's armrest. "Baby, don't move," I said, my hands shaking, as I tried to assess her injuries without causing more damage. "Just stay still, okay? Mommy's here." Emma was sobbing, but she was conscious and talking, which seemed like a miracle considering what had just happened. "It hurts," she kept saying. "Mom, it hurts everywhere." I looked back up the steps toward where my family stood frozen. Cairos looked genuinely shocked, his hand pressed to his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. Mariel stood beside him, but she wasn't looking at Emma or me. She was looking at Cedrick, who stood with his hands still extended from the pushing motion, a smirk playing around the edges of his mouth like he'd just executed a particularly clever practical joke. "Call 911, I shouted up at them. "Now!" But instead of moving toward the phone, Mariel descended the steps slowly, her face already arranging itself into an expression of calm concern. "Oh, honey," she said, crouching beside us. "Accidents happen. She'll be fine. Accidents happen." Those 2 words hit me like a physical blow. This hadn't been an accident. I'd seen Cedrick's face, seen the deliberate motion of his hands, heard the sound he'd made under his breath that might have been satisfaction or might have been laughter. "This wasn't an accident," I said, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "Cedrick pushed her. I saw him push her." Mariel's expression didn't change. "Ivy, you're upset. You're not seeing clearly. These things happen with wheelchairs. They're unpredictable." I stared at her, holding my injured daughter while blood dripped from Emma's scraped face onto my shirt, and I realized that my mother was going to lie. She was going to look at Emma's injuries and Cedrick's smirk, and my obvious terror. And she was going to pretend that what we'd all witnessed was somehow an unfortunate miscalculation rather than a deliberate assault. "Mom," Emma whispered, tugging on my sleeve. "I want to go home." But we couldn't go home. Not yet. Because Emma needed medical attention, and I needed to make sure she didn't have internal injuries or a concussion or any of the dozen other catastrophic possibilities that were racing through my mind. I looked back up the steps one more time. Cedrick had finally moved, but only to lean against the railing with his arms crossed, watching the scene below him like it was entertainment he'd arranged for his own amusement. And in that moment, I realized that my daughter and I were completely alone. The emergency room at Phoenix General became the stage for my family's complete moral collapse, and I had a front row seat to watch it unfold. Emma's injuries, thankfully, were less severe than they could have been. A broken left arm, multiple contusions, a mild concussion, and scrapes that would heal but leave scars. The X-rays showed no spinal damage beyond what she'd already sustained, which felt like a miracle considering the force of her impact with the concrete steps. But while Emma was being examined, something far more sinister was happening in the waiting room behind closed doors. I'd been with Emma through every test, every examination, holding her uninjured hand while she answered the doctor's questions in her careful, precise way. Dr. Julian Maraway, the emergency physician, was thorough and kind, explaining each procedure before he performed it and making sure Emma understood that she was safe now. When he asked Emma what had happened, she told him clearly, "My Uncle Cedrick pushed my wheelchair down the steps." Dr. Maraway's expression didn't change, but I saw something sharpen in his eyes. He asked a few more questions, gentle but specific, about exactly how the incident had occurred. Emma answered each one without hesitation or confusion. "I was going down the ramp like always," she explained, "and then Uncle Cedrick came up behind me and pushed really hard. I couldn't stop." After Emma's arm was casted and her other injuries were treated, Dr. Maraway asked to speak with me privately in the hallway. "Mrs. Terrelin," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "your daughter's account of what happened is very clear and consistent. In cases involving potential harm to a vulnerable individual, we're required to involve social services to ensure her safety." I felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because someone was finally taking this seriously. Terror because I knew how my family would react to outside scrutiny. "I want her protected," I said. "Whatever that means, whatever it takes." He nodded. "A social worker will be here within the hour to conduct interviews. They'll speak with you, with Emma, and with the family members who witnessed the incident." When we returned to the waiting room, I could immediately sense that something had changed. Cairos and Mariel were huddled together in the corner, speaking in urgent whispers. Cedrick sat apart from them, scrolling through his phone with studied indifference, but there was a tension in his posture that suggested he knew he was in trouble. Gee. Social worker, a woman named Veronica Fenroe, arrived 30 minutes later. She was small, efficient, with the kind of calm authority that suggested she'd seen every variation of family dysfunction and wasn't easily shocked or manipulated. She spoke with Emma first in a private room designed for sensitive conversations. Emma was tired and in pain, but she answered every question with the same clear consistency she'd shown with Dr. Maraway. When Veronica emerged from that interview, her expression was grim. She asked to speak with me next, then with each of my family members individually. I don't know exactly what my parents told her during their interviews, but I could guess. They'd probably painted Cedrick as misunderstood, me as overprotective, and the whole incident as a tragic accident compounded by family stress. When Cedrick's turn came, he walked into that interview room with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent his entire life being protected from consequences. He emerged 20 minutes later looking significantly less confident. Veronica requested that we all gather in the family conference room for what she called a safety planning discussion. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the chairs uncomfortable, and the air thick with the kind of tension that comes when people can no longer pretend everything is fine. Based on my interviews, Veronica began, there are significant discrepancies in the accounts of this afternoon's incident. Mariel immediately jumped in. We've explained that this was an accident. Wheelchairs can be unstable, especially on slopes. Cedrick was just trying to help. Mrs. Mandrel, Veronica said, consulting her notes. Your son told me he wasn't even on the patio when Emma fell. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at Cedrick, who was suddenly fascinated by his fingernails. That's not what Emma saw, I said. That's not what I saw. Emma is 7 years old, Cairos said, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived at the hospital. She's been through trauma. Sometimes the mind fills in details that weren't really there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father was suggesting that Emma had imagined her own assault. Emma has been in a wheelchair for 3 years, I said, my voice rising. She knows the difference between losing control accidentally and being pushed. She's not confused or traumatized into false memories. She's telling the truth. Mariel leaned forward, her voice taking on that saccharine tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something completely unreasonable. Ivy, honey, you've been under so much stress since the accident. Single motherhood, Emma's needs, the financial pressure. Sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we can misinterpret normal family interactions as something more sinister. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. They were sitting in a hospital emergency room, looking at Emma's broken arm and bandaged face, and suggesting that I'd somehow imagined or misunderstood her uncle deliberately pushing her wheelchair down concrete steps. I know what I saw, I said. But do you? Mariel asked, with fake concern dripping from every word. Really? Because Cedrick says he was in the bathroom when Emma fell, and accidents like this are actually quite common with wheelchair users. Veronica had been taking notes throughout this exchange, her pen moving steadily across her pad. Now she looked up and addressed Cedrick directly. Mr. Mandrel, when I asked you about your location during the incident, you told me you were helping your niece navigate the steps. Cedrick's face flushed. I meant I was nearby, in case she needed help, but I wasn't actually touching the wheelchair. But, now your mother says you were in the bathroom? The trap was elegant and obvious, but Cedrick walked right into it anyway. I was in the bathroom right before, then I came out to help, but she fell before I could get to her. Veronica made another note. So you did witness the fall? I saw her going down the steps too fast, but I couldn't stop it. Every answer made things worse for him, and I could see my parents realizing that their protective instincts might have put them in an impossible position. The thing is, Veronica continued, Emma's account is very specific about the physical contact. She says she felt hands on the back of her wheelchair, pushing with significant force. Dr. Maraway's examination of her injuries is consistent with a sudden, forceful propulsion rather than a gradual loss of control. Mariel's composure finally cracked. Are you seriously suggesting that Cedrick would deliberately hurt Emma, his own niece? That's monstrous. What's monstrous? I said, standing up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. Is watching your son assault my daughter, and then trying to convince everyone, including yourselves, that it didn't happen. The room erupted. Cairos was shouting about family loyalty. Mariel was crying and saying I was destroying the family, and Cedrick was on his feet demanding to know why everyone was ganging up on him over an accident. But through all the chaos, Veronica remained calm, continuing to take notes, and I realized that this scene itself was evidence. Their reaction to being questioned, their inability to maintain consistent stories, their immediate pivot to attacking me rather than expressing concern for Emma, all of it was being documented. Finally, Veronica raised her voice enough to cut through the arguing. "I'm going to be very clear about what happens next," she said. "This incident will be reported to the appropriate authorities. There will be a full investigation. And until that investigation is complete, I'm recommending that Emma not be left unsupervised with any family members who were present during today's incident." The silence that followed felt like the moment after lightning strikes, when you're waiting to see if the tree will fall. "You can't do that," Mariel whispered. "We're her grandparents." "I can and I am," Veronica replied. "My job is to protect Emma's safety, not to preserve family relationships." As we prepared to leave the hospital, Cairos pulled me aside one last time. "You know this will destroy our family," he said. I looked back toward the pediatric wing where Emma was finishing her discharge paperwork, her small form dwarfed by the hospital wheelchair they'd provided since hers had been damaged in the fall. "Cedrick destroyed our family when he decided my daughter was an acceptable target for his cruelty," I said. "I'm just making sure everyone else can see it too." The drive home from Phoenix felt like escaping a war zone, but the real battle was just beginning. Emma slept fitfully in her car seat, her casted arm awkwardly positioned, occasionally whimpering in pain even through her medication. Every sound she made felt like another piece of evidence of what Cedrick had done and what my parents had tried to cover up. But it wasn't until we were safely back in our house in Tucson, with Emma settled in her own bed and the familiar walls around us, that the full scope of the deception began to reveal itself. The text messages started before we'd even unpacked. From Mariel: "We need to talk before this gets out of hand. Family should handle family problems privately." From Cairos: "Ivy, you're making a terrible mistake. Think about Emma's future. Do you really want her growing up knowing she destroyed her own family?" From Cedrick: "Sorry accidents happen, but this is crazy. You're ruining everyone's life over nothing." I screenshot each message, something telling me I'd need evidence of their continued attempts to manipulate the narrative. That instinct would prove more valuable than I could have imagined. The next morning, while Emma was still sleeping off her pain medication, I received a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Terrellin? This is Andrea Corvale from Desert Plains Physical Therapy. I heard about Emma's accident. How is she doing?" Andrea's voice carried that specific kind of professional concern that meant she'd heard more than just the basic facts. Word traveled fast in the disability community, especially when it involved harm to a vulnerable individual. "She's physically okay," I said, surprised by how difficult it was to keep my voice steady. "Broken arm, some bruises, a mild concussion. It could have been much worse." "I'm so glad to hear that. Listen, I was hoping we could meet in person when you feel ready. There are some things about Emma's previous injuries that I'd like to discuss with you." Something in her tone made me immediately alert. "Previous injuries?" "Nothing recent," Andrea said quickly, "but some patterns I've noticed over the past few months that I should have addressed sooner. I was hoping they were coincidental, but after hearing about what happened in Phoenix, I think we need to look at the bigger picture." We arranged to meet that afternoon at her office, after Emma's follow-up appointment with our pediatrician, Dr. Lucan Faraway had been Emma's doctor since the original accident. He was thorough, gentle, and had never once made me feel like I was overreacting to concerns about Emma's health or safety. When he examined Emma's new injuries, his expression grew increasingly grim. "The pattern of bruising is concerning," he said, photographing Emma's injuries with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen too many cases like this. "These are consistent with forceful impact, not accidental contact." Emma, who had been unusually quiet throughout the examination, finally spoke up. Dr. Faraway? Will Uncle Cedrick get in trouble for pushing me? The doctor looked at me with raised eyebrows, then back at Emma. Emma, can you tell me about other times your uncle has been rough with you? What followed was a 15-minute conversation that shattered my understanding of what had been happening to my daughter during our family visits. Emma described incidents I'd dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. The time Cedrick had, accidentally, knocked her out of her wheelchair while she was transferring to the couch. The time he'd pushed her wheelchair into a wall and claimed he'd lost control. The time he'd grabbed her transfer board and thrown it across the room, claiming he was just playing around. Each incident, viewed in isolation, could have been explained away as clumsiness or inappropriate play. But together, they formed a clear pattern of escalating aggression toward a vulnerable individual who couldn't fight back or effectively report the abuse. Why didn't you tell me about these things before? I asked Emma, my heart breaking with each new revelation. You always looked so tired after we visited Grandma and Grandpa, she said in her matter-of-fact way. And they said Uncle Cedrick didn't mean to hurt me. They said he was just playing and I needed to be less sensitive. My parents had been coaching Emma to minimize and dismiss her own abuse. They'd been teaching her that her perceptions of mistreatment were wrong, that her uncle's cruelty was somehow her fault for being too sensitive. Dr. Faraway was making notes throughout this conversation, and when Emma finished talking, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Terrelin, I need to make a report to Child Protective Services about this pattern of incidents. This goes well beyond what happened in Phoenix. 2 hours later, I was sitting in Andrea's office, looking at photographs that made my stomach turn. I take progress. Photos of all my patients, Andrea explained, to document their physical condition and track changes over time. With Emma, I started noticing bruises and small injuries that didn't match her activity level or mobility limitations. She spread out a series of photos taken over the past 6 months. In each one, Emma was smiling bravely for the camera, but if you knew what to look for, the evidence was unmistakable. A fingerprint-shaped bruise on her arm, scratch marks on her neck, a swollen area on her back that I'd attributed to her wheelchair fit. I should have said something sooner, Andrea continued, her voice heavy with professional guilt. But Emma always had explanations for these injuries, and they seemed plausible individually. It's only when you look at them together that the pattern becomes clear. The pattern was abuse. Systematic, ongoing abuse that had been happening under my nose for months, possibly longer. There's something else, Andrea said, pulling out a folder marked with Emma's name. Emma's been drawing pictures during her rest breaks. Art therapy isn't my specialty, but these concerned me enough that I consulted with a colleague who works in trauma counseling. The drawings were heartbreaking. Stick figures of Emma in her wheelchair, surrounded by larger figures with angry faces and reaching hands. One drawing showed her wheelchair at the bottom of what looked like stairs, with a large figure standing at the top. The date on that drawing was 3 weeks before the Phoenix incident. Emma had been processing and predicting her own abuse through art, creating a visual record of trauma that she'd been taught to minimize or ignore. She drew these after visits with your family, Andrea noted. Always after those visits, never after other family activities or therapy sessions. I stared at the drawings, seeing my daughter's fear and vulnerability rendered in crayon and colored pencil. Each image was a cry for help that I'd been too blind or too hopeful to recognize. That evening, after Emma was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with all the evidence spread out before me. Dr. Faraway's photographs and notes, Andrea's documentation and drawings, screenshots of my family's, text messages, hospital records from Phoenix. The pattern was undeniable, even to someone who'd spent months making excuses for people she loved. Cedrick hadn't suddenly snapped and pushed Emma down the stairs. He'd been escalating his abuse for months, testing boundaries, seeing how much he could hurt her before anyone noticed or intervened. The Phoenix incident wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a systematic campaign of cruelty against a vulnerable individual. And my parents hadn't, just failed to protect Emma. They'd actively enabled her abuse by dismissing her reports, coaching her to minimize her own experiences, and creating a family culture where Cedrick's behavior was consistently excused and normalized. I picked up my phone and dialed Veronica, Fenro's number. "I have more evidence," I said when she answered. "Much more. And I think this has been going on a lot longer than anyone realized." The family intervention meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the Department of Children's Safety 3 days after my call to Veronica. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in harsh shadows, and the institutional furniture seemed designed to make everyone uncomfortable, which was probably the point. Veronica had arranged for a mediator, Callum Straven, who specialized in family, crisis situations. He was a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of patient expression that suggested he'd seen every possible variation of family dysfunction and wasn't easily surprised by human cruelty. My parents arrived 20 minutes late, which I recognized as a power play designed to show their disapproval of the entire process. Mariel wore her best church dress and carried herself with the injured dignity of someone who believed she was being persecuted for imaginary crimes. Cairos looked uncomfortable, but determined, his jaw set in that stubborn expression I remembered from my teenage years when he'd decided something was non-negotiable. Cedrick slouched in behind them, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt that was probably the most formal clothing he owned. He'd made some attempt to comb his hair, but his overall demeanor suggested he viewed this meeting as an inconvenience he'd have to endure before everyone came to their senses and left him alone. Emma wasn't present, thankfully. She was spending the day with my friend Rowena Thalrick, who had volunteered to keep her occupied while the adults attempted to sort out this mess. Rowena had been horrified when I'd told her what happened, and her support had been one of the few bright spots in an otherwise devastating week. Callum opened the meeting by explaining the process and laying out ground rules for respectful communication. Then he turned to me and asked me to present my concerns. I'd prepared extensively for this moment, organizing all the evidence Andrea and Dr. Faraway had helped me compile. I spoke calmly and methodically, presenting each piece of documentation, while my family sat in stony silence. The photographs of Emma's unexplained bruises, her drawings depicting fear and trauma after family visits, the clear escalation pattern leading up to the Phoenix incident, Dr. Faraway's medical assessment confirming that Emma's injuries were consistent with deliberate force rather than accidental contact. When I finished, the room was quiet except for the humming of the air conditioning system. Callum looked at my family. "I'd like to hear your response to these allegations." Cairos spoke first, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated during 30 years as a high school principal. "This is all very sad," he said, "but Ivy has been under tremendous stress since her husband died. Single motherhood is difficult, especially with a disabled individual. Sometimes that stress can cause people to see patterns that aren't really there." The casual dismissal was breathtaking. He was looking at photographs of his granddaughter's injuries and medical documentation of abuse, and suggesting that I'd imagined the entire thing due to maternal stress. "These aren't imaginary bruises," I said, pointing to the photographs. "These aren't stress-induced drawings." Emma described specific incidents of Cedrick hurting her. Mariel leaned forward, her voice taking on that concerned maternal tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something completely unreasonable. "Emma is a traumatized individual," she said. "She's been through so much with the accident and losing her father. Sometimes trauma victims create stories to explain their pain. It doesn't mean the stories are true." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. My mother was suggesting that Emma had fabricated months of abuse allegations as some kind of psychological coping mechanism. "Emma's trauma specialist has evaluated her," I said. "She shows no signs of false memory syndrome or confabulation. Her accounts are consistent, detailed and corroborated by physical evidence. Alleged physical evidence, Cedrick said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Bruises happen. Kids get bumps and scrapes. Just because Emma has some marks doesn't mean I did anything wrong. His casual dismissal of Emma's injuries as routine bumps and scrapes revealed exactly how he viewed her, not as a person deserving of protection and respect, but as a thing whose pain was inconsequential. Veronica had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she opened her case file and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "I've conducted interviews with Emma on 3 separate occasions," she said. Her account of the abuse has been consistent every time, down to specific details about timing, location, and the nature of the physical contact. I've also spoken with Dr. Faraway and Andrea Corvell, both of whom have documented concerning patterns over several months. She looked directly at Cedrick. "Mr. Mandrell, during our previous conversation, you told me you weren't present when Emma fell down the stairs. Then you said you witnessed the fall but couldn't prevent it. Now you're claiming that her injuries are just routine bumps and scrapes. Which version of events should I believe?" Cedrick's face flushed, and I could see him struggling to come up with a response that wouldn't contradict his previous statements. "I don't remember exactly what I said before," he mumbled. "This whole thing has been confusing." "What's confusing?" I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm, "is how you can look at pictures of Emma's injuries and claim they're normal. What's confusing is how you can listen to her describe being hurt by you and dismiss it as imagination." Mariel immediately jumped to Cedrick's defense. "You're putting words in his mouth, Ivy. He never said Emma was imagining things. He's just pointing out that correlation doesn't equal causation. Emma might have bruises, and she might have spent time with Cedrick, but that doesn't prove he caused the bruises." The gaslighting was so systematic and sophisticated that I wondered if they'd practiced these responses together. Every piece of evidence was being reframed as coincidence, misunderstanding, or stress-induced misperception. Callum had been taking notes throughout the discussion, and now he set down his pen and addressed my parents directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Mandrell, putting aside the question of whether abuse occurred, I'm concerned about your response to your granddaughter's allegations. Even if you believe these incidents were misunderstood, Emma clearly feels unsafe around her uncle. What steps are you prepared to take to address her concerns?" Cairos and Mariel exchanged a look that I recognized from my childhood. The silent communication that happened when they were coordinating their response to one of my infractions. "We think Emma needs professional help," Cairos said finally. "Not because she's making up stories, but because she's clearly processing some difficult emotions about her disability and her father's death. Maybe she's projecting some of that anger onto Cedrick. So your solution is to send Emma to therapy to fix her perception of abuse, rather than addressing the behavior that's making her feel unsafe?" Veronica asked. "We're suggesting that Emma work with someone who can help her understand the difference between intentional harm and accidental contact," Mariel replied smoothly. "Cedrick has never meant to hurt her. He loves Emma very much." "If he loves her very much," I said, "then why does she flinch every time he enters a room? Why does she draw pictures of herself being hurt by a large figure after every family visit? Why did she tell her doctor that she's afraid of her uncle?" "Because you've poisoned her against him," Cedrick said, his composure finally cracking. "You've been putting ideas in her head, making her think normal family interactions are dangerous. You're the one traumatizing her." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. After months of watching my daughter suffer in silence, after collecting evidence of systematic abuse, after fighting to protect her from further harm, I was being accused of causing the very trauma I was trying to stop. "I've never coached Emma to say anything about you," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "Every allegation she's made has been spontaneous and unprompted. Every injury has been documented by medical professionals. Every concerning behavior has been witnessed by trained therapists." "Allegedly," Mariel said with that infuriating calm. Everything you're describing is your interpretation of ambiguous situations. You're seeing abuse where there's simply family life. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, but it became increasingly clear that no amount of evidence would convince my family to acknowledge what had happened to Emma. They'd constructed an alternative reality where Cedrick was a misunderstood victim, Emma was a confused individual creating false narratives, and I was a hysterical mother seeing danger where none existed. Every photograph was explained away. Every medical opinion was questioned. Every piece of testimony was reframed as unreliable or biased. When Callum finally called an end to the session, nothing had been resolved except my complete understanding that my family would never protect Emma, no matter how much evidence I provided or how clearly she communicated her fear and pain. As we prepared to leave, Cairos approached me one last time. "You know this will destroy our family," he said quietly. "Emma is my family," I replied, "and I will not sacrifice her safety for your comfort." Outside in the parking lot, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline of finally understanding that there would be no reconciliation, no moment of clarity where my family suddenly realized they'd been wrong. They would choose Cedrick over Emma, every single time. They would rewrite history, dismiss evidence, and gaslight everyone involved rather than admit that they'd failed to protect a vulnerable individual from systematic abuse. But for the first time in months, I felt something that might have been relief. Because now I knew exactly what I was fighting, and I was no longer waiting for them to become the people I'd hoped they could be. The transformation from grieving daughter to strategic advocate happened overnight, but it felt like it had been building for years. The morning after the failed family meeting, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. The fog of hope and denial had finally lifted, leaving behind a landscape that was harsh but navigable. Emma was still asleep, her casted arm propped carefully on pillows, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. Looking at her, I made a promise that would define everything that followed. No one would ever hurt her again on my watch, regardless of what it cost me personally or professionally. I started with coffee and a legal pad, sitting at my kitchen table as the Arizona sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Timeline of abuse, evidence collection." Below that, I began constructing what would become the most important document of my life. The first call was to Andrea Corvale. She answered on the second ring, her voice already carrying the kind of professional alertness that suggested she'd been expecting to hear from me. "Ivy? How did the meeting go yesterday?" "About as well as you'd expect," I said. "They denied everything. Every single piece of evidence was explained away or dismissed. They're claiming Emma is confused, I'm hysterical, and Cedrick is a misunderstood victim." Andrea was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, but I can't say I'm surprised. Families often close ranks when faced with abuse allegations, especially when the perpetrator has been enabled for a long time. I need your help," I said. "I need to document everything systematically, every piece of evidence, every interaction, every medical record. If this is going to court or to a formal investigation, I want the case to be bulletproof." "I was hoping you'd say that," Andrea replied. "I've been thinking about this since our last conversation, and I believe we need to approach this like a medical research project. Hypothesis, evidence collection, analysis, and conclusions based on objective data." We arranged to meet that afternoon at her office after Emma's scheduled therapy session. Andrea had already begun compiling what she called the comprehensive file. Every photograph, every progress note, every observation she'd made about Emma's physical and emotional state over the past 8 months. While Emma napped that morning, I began my own systematic review. I pulled out every calendar, every receipt, every text message that related to our family interactions. What emerged was a pattern so clear it was disturbing I hadn't seen it sooner. The abuse had escalated in direct correlation with Emma's increasing independence and confidence. The first documented incident occurred 3 weeks after Emma had successfully transferred from her wheelchair to the couch without assistance, a milestone that had filled me with pride, but apparently triggered something dark in Cedrick's psychology. Each subsequent incident corresponded with Emma achieving some new level of autonomy or receiving positive attention for her progress. When she'd learned to navigate curbs independently, Cedrick had accidentally knocked her out of her wheelchair the next day. When Dr. Faraway had praised her strength improvements, Cedrick had thrown her transfer board across the room that same evening, claiming he was just playing around. The pattern suggested that Cedrick's abuse wasn't random cruelty, but systematic sabotage designed to undermine Emma's confidence and independence. He was threatened by a 7-year-old's resilience and was actively working to destroy it. At Andrea's office that afternoon, Emma worked through her exercises with a determination that broke my heart. Despite everything she'd endured, she was still fighting to get stronger, still believing that her effort mattered. While Emma practiced transfers, Andrea and I spread out the comprehensive file on her desk. The documentation was staggering in its thoroughness. "I photograph every patient at each session," Andrea explained, "partly for insurance purposes, but mostly to track subtle changes that might not be obvious day to day. With Emma, I started noticing patterns that concerned me, but that I initially attributed to her learning to navigate her environment more actively. She showed me a progression of photographs taken over 6 months. In the early images, Emma looked confident and happy, proud of her accomplishments. As the months progressed, subtle changes became apparent. Her posture became more defensive. Her smiles looked forced. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, suggesting sleep disruption. "Here's what really concerned me," Andrea continued, pulling out a series of close-up photographs. "These bruises on her arms and back. They're in locations that aren't typical for wheelchair users, even active ones who might have minor collisions or falls." She pointed to fingerprint-shaped marks on Emma's upper arms. "These suggest someone gripping her forcefully. And these linear bruises on her back are consistent with being pushed against hard edges, like stair railings or door frames." The medical evidence was overwhelming, but Andrea had gone further. She'd documented behavioral changes as well. "Emma's anxiety levels increased dramatically around the same time these physical signs appeared," she said, showing me her session notes. "She started asking questions about whether certain family members would be at therapy sessions. She began having difficulty concentrating during exercises that had been routine for her. She started apologizing for things that weren't her fault." Andrea had noted every instance where Emma had made self-deprecating comments or expressed fear about disappointing people. The behavioral documentation painted a picture of a normally confident individual being systematically broken down by someone who was supposed to protect her. "There's something else," Andrea said, her voice becoming more serious. "I consulted with Dr. Mariel, who specializes in trauma psychology for individuals with disabilities. She reviewed Emma's drawings and behavioral changes, and her assessment is that Emma shows classic signs of ongoing psychological abuse in addition to the physical trauma." She handed me Dr. Elthorne's written evaluation. The language was clinical, but devastating. "Subject exhibits hypervigilance, regression in previously mastered emotional skills, somatic complaints without medical basis, and artistic expressions consistent with chronic fear and learned helplessness. Emma needs specialized counseling," Andrea continued, "not because she's confused about what happened to her, but because she's been systematically conditioned to doubt her own perceptions and minimize her own pain. That evening, I called Dr. Faraway's office and requested copies of all Emma's medical records from the past year. When they arrived 2 days later, I spread them out chronologically and began cross-referencing them with my calendar and Andrea's photographs. The correlation was undeniable. Every unexplained injury, every concerning symptom, Every behavioral regression coincided with family visits or interactions with Cedrick. But the medical records also revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated: the financial cost of the abuse. Emma had required additional X-rays after 3 separate incidents that I'd dismissed as accidents. She'd needed extra physical therapy sessions to regain strength and mobility that had been compromised by her injuries. We'd made multiple trips to urgent care for wounds and bruises that I'd attributed to her learning to navigate her environment more independently. The total cost of treating the consequences of Cedrick's abuse was over $8,000 in medical bills, not including the emotional therapy Emma would need to recover from the psychological trauma. I created a spreadsheet documenting every expense, every missed day of work, while I dealt with Emma's accidents, every therapy session that had been necessary to address setbacks that weren't actually setbacks, but sabotage. The next phase of documentation required me to do something I'd never done before: research the legal implications of what had happened to Emma. I spent hours online reading about disability rights, vulnerable person abuse statutes, and the legal definitions of assault and battery. What I learned made me physically sick, but also filled me with a cold determination. Under Arizona law, knowingly causing physical injury to a vulnerable adult or individual with disabilities was a felony, regardless of the relationship between perpetrator and victim. The fact that Emma was a minor with a documented disability made the legal consequences even more severe. But more importantly, I learned that the systematic nature of the abuse, the attempts to cover it up, and the family's coordinated gaslighting response could potentially constitute conspiracy charges for everyone involved. I contacted 3 different attorneys who specialized in disability rights and family law. The first consultation was with Alessandra Corin, a lawyer who had built her reputation defending vulnerable individuals and their families. "Mrs. Terrallen," she said after reviewing my preliminary documentation, "this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of systematic abuse I've encountered. The combination of medical evidence, professional observations, and behavioral documentation creates a compelling legal foundation." She explained that there were multiple potential legal avenues: criminal prosecution for assault and battery, civil suits for damages and ongoing care costs, and restraining orders to ensure Emma's continued safety. "However," she continued, "you need to understand that pursuing legal action against your family will be emotionally devastating and potentially expensive. They will likely hire their own attorneys and attempt to discredit you, Emma, and everyone who has supported your allegations." "They've already been trying to discredit us," I said. "The only difference is that now we'll be fighting back with evidence instead of just hoping they'll develop consciences." Attorney Corin smiled grimly. "Then let's build a case that's absolutely unshakable." Over the following week, I worked with Attorney Corin and her team to organize the evidence into what she called prosecutable form. Every document was copied, dated, and organized chronologically. Every witness statement was recorded and notarized. Every photograph was enhanced and analyzed by experts who could testify about the nature and likely causes of Emma's injuries. The process was methodical and exhausting, but it was also empowering in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I'd felt helpless, watching Emma suffer while being told I was imagining things or overreacting. Now I was building something solid and undeniable, creating a foundation for justice that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. Dr. Elthorn agreed to serve as an expert witness, providing professional testimony about the psychological impact of the abuse and the likelihood that Emma's accounts were accurate and reliable. Andrea compiled her complete file and prepared to testify about the physical evidence and behavioral changes she documented. Dr. Faraway provided a comprehensive medical assessment confirming that Emma's injuries were consistent with intentional harm rather than accidents related to her disability or mobility equipment. But the most powerful evidence came from Emma herself. Dr. Elthorn conducted a series of forensic interviews designed to elicit Emma's account of events without leading questions or suggestive techniques. The recordings were heartbreaking but legally crucial. Emma described each incident with clarity and consistency, providing details that a 7-year-old couldn't have fabricated even if she'd been coached. She drew pictures during the interviews that matched her verbal accounts perfectly. Most importantly, her emotional responses were authentic and age-appropriate, showing the kind of genuine distress that couldn't be manufactured. "Mommy," she said during one of these sessions, "I don't want Uncle Cedrick to hurt other kids like me. Maybe if he gets in trouble, he won't hurt anyone else." That statement, recorded by Dr. Elthorn and witnessed by Attorney Corin, would become the cornerstone of our case. Emma wasn't seeking revenge. She was trying to protect other vulnerable individuals from experiencing what she'd endured. While building the legal case, I was also preparing for the personal fallout that would inevitably follow. I changed Emma's school pickup procedures, ensuring that only pre-approved individuals could collect her. I installed security cameras around our house and updated our locks. I opened a new bank account that my parents couldn't access and transferred all our important documents to a safety deposit box. Most importantly, I began building what would become our new support network. Rowena Thalrick became our emergency contact and backup guardian. Andrea introduced me to other parents of individuals with disabilities who had faced similar challenges. Dr. Elthorn connected us with support groups for families dealing with abuse situations. What emerged was a community of people who understood that protecting vulnerable individuals sometimes meant making difficult choices that others wouldn't understand or support. These people became our chosen family, the network that would sustain us through the legal battles and family estrangement that lay ahead. By the end of that month, we had assembled what Attorney Corin described as the most comprehensive abuse documentation I've seen in 15 years of practice. The evidence was organized, the witnesses were prepared, and the legal strategy was clearly defined. But more than that, I had transformed from a confused and defensive mother into someone who understood exactly what she was fighting for and how to win that fight. The grieving, hopeful daughter who had walked into that family meeting was gone, replaced by an advocate who would not be silenced, dismissed, or manipulated. Emma was healing, both physically and emotionally, but she was also learning something crucial about her own worth and her right to safety. She was seeing her mother fight for her with everything available, demonstrating that her well-being mattered more than family peace or social appearances. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" she asked one evening as we organized some of the evidence, files. "We're going to be better than okay," I told her, and for the first time in months, I completely believed it. The documentation phase was complete. Now it was time to release the truth. The call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Attorney Corin had filed our formal complaint with the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office. I was making Emma's breakfast when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize but had been expecting. "Mrs. Terrellin, this is Detective Kurt Krestrel with the Maricopa County Special Victims Unit. We've received your case file, and I'd like to schedule an interview to discuss the allegations against Cedrick Mandrell." The formality of it hit me like a physical weight. This was no longer a family dispute or a social services concern. This was a criminal investigation into the systematic abuse of a disabled individual, and my brother was about to become a defendant rather than a family member I was trying to protect. Emma looked up from her cereal when she heard me say, "Detective." Her dark eyes immediately alert in that way they'd become since Phoenix. She'd learned to read the emotional temperature of conversations, a skill no 7-year-old should need to develop. "Is that about Uncle Cedrick?" she asked quietly. I nodded, covering the phone's microphone. "The police want to talk to us about what happened." Emma's expression didn't change, but she sat up straighter in her wheelchair. "Good," she said with a matter-of-fact tone that broke my heart. "Maybe now he won't hurt other kids." "Detective?" Krestrel was nothing like the police officers I'd encountered in television shows or movies. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm competence that suggested he'd handled hundreds of similar cases. When he arrived at our house that afternoon, He spent the first 10 minutes simply talking with Emma about her art and her physical therapy, establishing rapport without any pressure. "Emma," he said eventually, "I understand that some things happened with your uncle that made you feel unsafe. Can you tell me about that? What followed was the most difficult hour of my life up to that point." Emma described each incident with the same clarity and consistency she'd shown with Dr. Elthorn, but hearing it recounted to a police officer made the abuse feel more real and more serious than it ever had before. Detective Kestrel took notes throughout Emma's account, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never leading or suggesting answers. When she finished, he looked at me with an expression that was both professional and deeply human. "Mrs. Terrelin, based on Emma's testimony and the evidence your attorney has provided, we have sufficient grounds to file charges against Mr. Mandrell for aggravated assault against a vulnerable person. Given the systematic nature of the alleged abuse and the victim's age and disability status, this would be prosecuted as a felony." The words hung in the air between us. Felony charges. Criminal. Prosecution. My brother facing potential prison time for what he'd done to my daughter. "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll need to interview the other family members who were present during these incidents," Detective Kestrel explained. "We'll also be working with the medical professionals who documented Emma's injuries. If the evidence supports filing charges, Mr. Mandrell will be arrested and arraigned." That evening, after Emma was asleep, I sat in my living room staring at my phone. Detective Kestrel had warned me that word of the investigation would likely reach my family within hours, either through official notification or through the informal networks that exist in every community. I decided they should hear it from me first. I started with a group text to Cairos, Mariel, and Cedrick. "The police are investigating Cedrick for felony assault against Emma. Detective Kestrel will be contacting you for interviews. I thought you should know before he calls, the POW." Response was immediate and explosive. Cairos called within minutes, his voice shaking with rage. "Ivy, what have you done? You're going to destroy this family over imaginary problems." "The problems aren't imaginary," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Emma has been systematically abused for months, and now there will finally be consequences." "You're delusional," he shouted, abandoning any pretense of calm discussion. "Cedrick has never hurt Emma. You're making up stories because you can't handle being a single parent." Before I could respond, he hung up. Marielle's call came 20 minutes later. She was crying, or at least making the sounds of someone crying, though her voice carried the calculated manipulation I'd learned to recognize. "How could you do this to us?" she sobbed. "We're your family. We've always been there for you and Emma." "You've been there for Cedrick," I corrected. "You've never been there for Emma. Not when she needed protection, not when she was being hurt, not when she tried to tell you what was happening. She's confused, Ivy. You know she's confused. And now you're going to put her through the trauma of a court case because you want to punish Cedrick for imaginary crimes." The gaslighting was so familiar I could have predicted every word. Emma was confused. I was vindictive. Cedrick was innocent. The real trauma was the investigation, not the abuse that necessitated it. "Emma isn't confused," I said. "She's brave. She's braver than any of us because she's willing to tell the truth, even when the adults around her refuse to hear it." Marielle's sobs intensified. "You're going to destroy our family reputation. Everyone will think we're monsters." "You are monsters," I said quietly. "You watched someone systematically abuse a disabled individual, and you chose to protect the abuser instead of the victim. That's exactly what monsters do." This time I hung up first. Cedrick's response came via text message. "This is insane. No, I never meant to hurt Emma. Accidents happen. You're ruining my life over nothing." I screenshot the message and forwarded it to Attorney Corin. His casual dismissal of months of documented abuse as accidents would be useful evidence of his mindset and lack of accountability. The next day, Detective Kestrel called to inform me that he'd attempted to interview my parents and Cedrick. Cairos and Mariel had declined to speak without an attorney present. Cedrick had agreed to answer questions but had consistently claimed he couldn't remember specific incidents and suggested that Emma might be making up stories for attention. His responses were not particularly helpful to his case, Detective Kestrel said dryly. Most innocent people don't need to consult attorneys before explaining why they didn't hurt a disabled individual. Within 48 hours of Detective Kestrel's interviews, something unexpected happened. Other people began coming forward. The first was Dr. Faraway's nurse, Celia Demara, who had been present during several of Emma's appointments following suspicious injuries. She contacted Detective Kestrel to report that she'd documented concerning patterns in Emma's medical records and had notes about behavioral changes that coincided with family visits. Then Andrea received a call from another physical therapist in the network, someone who had worked with Emma briefly during a coverage situation. That therapist, Nadia Crestwell, had observed an interaction between Emma and Cedrick during a family therapy session and had been troubled enough to make notes about Emma's visible fear response when her uncle was present. Most surprisingly, a teacher from Emma's school reached out through the district's reporting system. Ms. Lyra Ashvell had taught Emma the previous year and had noticed that Emma's behavioral changes seemed to correlate with certain family events. She'd documented instances where Emma had seemed unusually withdrawn or anxious after weekends with extended family. What emerged was a network of professionals who had individually noticed concerning patterns, but hadn't felt they had sufficient evidence to report their suspicions. The criminal investigation had given them permission to share their observations, creating a comprehensive picture of Emma's experience that went far beyond what I'd been able to document alone. The community response was equally powerful but more complicated. Word of the investigation spread through Emma's school, our neighborhood, and the Disability Services Network with the speed that sensitive information always travels in small communities. Most of the responses were supportive. Parents of other individuals with disabilities reached out to share their own experiences and offer solidarity. Emma's classmates made cards expressing their hope that she was feeling better. Teachers and therapists who worked with vulnerable populations sent messages of encouragement and offered professional testimony if needed. But there was also backlash, particularly from people who knew my family socially or professionally. Cairos had worked in the school district for 3 decades, and Mariel was active in several charitable organizations. They had social capital and relationships that they immediately leveraged to control the narrative. I started hearing through mutual acquaintances that my parents were describing me as mentally unstable and vindictive following her husband's death. They claimed that Emma was being manipulated by her traumatized mother, and that the investigation was a tragic misunderstanding that was destroying an innocent man's life. The whisper campaign was sophisticated and effective. Some people who had initially offered support became distant and non-committal. A few parents at Emma's school began treating her differently, as if she were somehow tainted by the controversy surrounding her family. But I had learned something crucial during the documentation phase. Truth supported by evidence is more powerful than lies supported by social pressure. Every time someone suggested that Emma was confused or that I was overreacting, I could point to medical records, professional assessments, and police investigations. The most difficult moment came when Cedrick's attorney, a man named Travis Derrick, contacted me directly to suggest a family resolution that would avoid the trauma and expense of criminal prosecution. "Ms. Tara Lynn," he said during our brief phone conversation, "my client is willing to acknowledge that some misunderstandings occurred and to agree to supervised visitation with Emma in the future. In exchange, your family is asking that you consider dropping the criminal charges and handling this matter privately." The offer was exactly what I'd expected. Acknowledge some vague misunderstandings, accept minimal consequences, and return to the system that had enabled Emma's abuse for months. "Mr. Derrick," I said, Your client systematically abused a disabled individual for months while her grandparents watched and did nothing. There's no misunderstanding to resolve. There are crimes to prosecute and an individual to protect. AI. Criminal process will be very difficult for Emma, he pressed. Court testimony, cross-examination, public attention. Is that really what you want to put her through? What I want to put her through is the experience of seeing justice served, and knowing that adults will fight for her safety even when it's difficult, I replied. What I won't put her through is returning to a family system where her abuse is minimized and her abuser is protected. Attorney Corin had prepared me for this conversation, warning me that defense attorneys often try to manipulate victims' families by suggesting that seeking justice will cause more trauma than the original abuse. The only trauma, Attorney Corin had explained, would be teaching Emma that her safety matters less than family harmony. The court process might be challenging, but it will also show her that her voice has power and her pain has value. 2 weeks after declining the settlement offer, Detective Kestrel called with news that changed everything. Mrs. Terrelin, we've completed our investigation and the district attorney has decided to file charges. Cedrick Mandrell will be arrested tomorrow on charges of aggravated assault against a vulnerable person, with additional charges of endangering the welfare of an individual with disabilities. The formal charges carried potential sentences of up to 7 years in prison if Cedrick was convicted on all counts. That evening, I sat down with Emma to explain what would happen next. She was working on a puzzle at the kitchen table, her concentration absolute as she fitted pieces together with the patience and precision that had become characteristic of her approach to everything since the accident. Emma? I said, sitting beside her wheelchair. The police have decided that Uncle Cedrick broke the law when he hurt you. He's going to be arrested and there will be a trial. Emma looked up from her puzzle, her expression serious but not fearful. Will I have to talk to more people about what happened? Probably, I said honestly. But everyone you'll talk to will be trying to help you, and I'll be there with you every step of the way. Emma nodded and returned to her puzzle, fitting a small blue piece into what looked like a corner of sky. Mom, she said without looking up, I'm not scared anymore. I'm glad, baby. You don't ever have to be scared of Uncle Cedrick again. I'm not scared of anyone, she clarified, and something in her voice made me pay closer attention. She had found her own strength through this process, not in spite of the trauma, but because of her response to it. Emma had learned that her voice mattered, that adults would listen when she spoke truth, and that she had the power to protect herself and potentially other vulnerable individuals. The phone rang as we sat together, working on the puzzle. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Mariel's name. I let it go to voicemail. Later that night, I played the message. Ivy, please, think about what you're doing to this family. Cedrick made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to go to prison. Emma, we'll get over this, but our family will never recover. Please call me. We can work this out. I deleted the message without returning the call. Some truths are too important to negotiate away, and Emma's safety was the most important truth of all. 6 months after Cedrick's arrest, I stood in the kitchen of our new house in Flagstaff, watching Emma navigate the accessible workspace we'd designed together. The morning light streamed through windows that faced east toward the mountains, and everything about our daily routine felt lighter than it had in years. Emma was making pancakes for breakfast, a skill Andrea had helped her develop during occupational therapy sessions that had evolved from medical necessity into joyful exploration. Her movements were confident and efficient, adapted perfectly to her height and reach from her wheelchair. Mom, do you think Rowena will like the blueberry ones? She asked, carefully folding fruit into the batter. Rowena Thalrick had become much more than Emma's temporary guardian during the worst of the legal proceedings. She'd evolved into the grandmother Emma had always deserved, someone who saw her disability as simply one characteristic among many rather than a defining limitation. She'll love them, I assured Emma, especially since you picked the blueberries yourself yesterday. We'd moved to Flagstaff 3 months earlier, after Cedrick accepted a plea agreement that included 18 months in prison, 5 years of probation, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with Emma or me. The plea had spared Emma from testifying at trial, though she'd told me she would have been willing to face him in court if necessary. "I want other kids to know they can tell the truth about people who hurt them," she'd said when we discussed the plea offer. At 8 years old, Emma had developed a fierce protective instinct toward other vulnerable individuals that both amazed and humbled me. The move to Flagstaff represented more than just physical distance from my family. It was a complete reconstruction of our lives around our own values and priorities, rather than the toxic dynamics that had nearly destroyed us both. Emma thrived in her new school, where the special education team understood that accommodation wasn't charity, but equity. Her teacher, Ms. Camille Drovene, had experience working with trauma survivors and had created an environment where Emma felt both challenged and safe. More importantly, Emma had made friends who saw her wheelchair as simply the way she moved, through the world, not a tragedy to be pitied or overcome. She participated in adaptive sports programs and had discovered a talent for wheelchair racing that filled her with pure joy. My own transformation had been equally profound. The woman who had once prioritized family peace over her daughter's safety was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love requires courage and boundaries. I'd started a support group for parents of individuals with disabilities who had experienced abuse or neglect within their own families. Meeting monthly at the community center, we created a space where people could share their experiences without judgment and develop strategies for protection and healing. The hardest part, one mother had shared during our most recent meeting, was accepting that being related to someone doesn't make them safe for your individual. The group had grown from 4 parents to nearly 20, connected by our shared understanding that protecting vulnerable family members sometimes meant fighting against other family members. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about Cairos and Mariel, wondering if they'd ever achieved the self-awareness to understand what they'd lost. According to mutual acquaintances, they'd moved to a retirement community in Scottsdale, where they undoubtedly told sanitized versions of our family's story that cast them as victims of their ungrateful daughter's vindictiveness. I'd learned to feel sorry for them without feeling responsible for their choices. They would live with the consequences of prioritizing their comfort over Emma's safety, just as Emma and I were living with the consequences of choosing truth over family harmony. The difference was that our consequences included peace, healing, and authentic relationships built on honesty rather than obligation. Emma rolled her wheelchair to the table where I was setting out plates and napkins. "Mom, when Rowena gets here, can we show her the pictures from my race last weekend?" "Of course," I said, remembering the pure joy on Emma's face as she'd crossed the finish line in second place, her arms pumping with determination and pride. That race had been a milestone in ways that went beyond athletic achievement. Emma had competed without fear, celebrated without apology, and accepted congratulations without the self-consciousness that had characterized her interactions for so long. The bye doorbell rang, announcing Rowena's arrival for our traditional Sunday breakfast. She'd driven up from Phoenix, making the 2-hour journey every other weekend since we'd moved, demonstrating the kind of consistency and reliability that Emma had never experienced from her biological grandparents. "My favorite girls," Rowena announced as she entered, carrying fresh flowers from her garden and moving carefully to accommodate the arthritis that had become her own mobility challenge. Emma hugged her enthusiastically, and I watched the easy affection between them with gratitude that still sometimes surprised me with its intensity. Later, as we sat around the table sharing stories and planning our week, I realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like: safe, supportive, and unconditionally loving. Emma had learned that she deserved relationships that honored her worth rather than tolerated her presence. I had learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish but necessary. Together, We had learned that healing was possible when truth was valued more than comfort. That afternoon, after Rowena returned to Phoenix, Emma and I sat on our back porch watching clouds drift over the mountains. She was sketching in her art pad, creating images that reflected hope and strength rather than the fear and confusion that had once dominated her drawings. "Mom," she said without looking up from her work, "I'm glad we moved here." "Me too, baby. Do you miss anything about Phoenix?" Emma considered the question seriously. Her pencil paused above the paper. "I miss the idea of having a big family," she said finally. "But I don't miss being scared or having to pretend everything was okay when it wasn't." Her wisdom, earned through experiences no individual should have to endure, never ceased to amaze. "Me?" "We have a family," I reminded her. "It's just different than the one we used to have." Emma smiled and returned to her drawing, adding details to what looked like a mountain landscape with a small figure in a wheelchair at the center, surrounded by friends and supporters. "Our family is better," she said simply, and she was absolutely right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.